Hello, welcome. Thanks for being here tonight. I'm Michelle White, curator here at the Menil collection. So tonight's program is in association with our current exhibition, Between Land and Sea, Artist of the Coenties Slip. The show brings together the work of 6 artists who were living and working in the late 1950s and early 1960s in an area of lower Manhattan called the Coenties Slip. The artists include Ellsworth Kelly, Agnes Martin, Lenore Tawney, Jack Youngerman, Robert Indiana, and Chrissa. So it was a community that was deeply influenced by their watery location, one really steeped in maritime history, and distinguished by the views of the East River and the Brooklyn Bridge. And so what I really hope this presentation does is reveal these incredible shared connections and formal correspondences between the work by these artists, some that we know quite well, and some that I hope you discover for the first time like I did in the process of doing this exhibition. So before I introduce our guests, I want to let you know that we will be welcoming art historian Christina Rosenberger on May 24th at 7 p.m. She will be speaking about her new book, which is incredible and at the Menil bookstore right now, Drawing the Line, the early work of Agnes Martin. And I'd like to also encourage you to come back tomorrow night right here, 7 p.m. We are hosting an incredible symposium on surrealism in the 1960s. So our first guest tonight is Suzanne Hudson. Suzanne received her PhD from Princeton University and is currently Associate Professor of Art History and Fine Arts at the University of Southern California in Los Angeles. She has written quite extensively on modern and contemporary art, with an emphasis on abstraction, painting, process, and American philosophy. She is co-founder of the Contemporary Art Think Tank and the Society of Contemporary Art Historians, which is an affiliate society of the College Art Association, for which she currently serves as President Emerita and Chair of the Executive Committee. She's also a member of the editorial board of CAA Reviews and on the advisory board of the Archives of American Art Journal. Suzanne is a regular contributor to Art Forum, which is how I first came across your work. She's also the author of Robert Ryman, Used Paint, Painting Now, and the co-editor of Contemporary Art, 1989 to the Present. She's currently working on Better for the Making, Art, Therapy, and Process, which is a study of the therapeutic basis of process within American visual modernism. So I'm really happy to have Suzanne here. Thank you. I have long followed her work, and while I was doing research on this exhibition, her work on Agnes Martin really made an impression. Her publication, current publication, focuses on one painting. It's Agnes Martin's Night Sea, and it's a publication that was done by After All and MIT Press that was published just this year. And it really beautifully weaves together an analysis of the painting, the specific painting, with its history, including Martin's time at the Slip, to her close and influential relationship with Lenore Tawney, which we'll talk about tonight. So following Suzanne's talk, Sarah Rothenberg, who's here tonight, thank you, will perform the composition In a Landscape by American composer John Cage. She'll speak a bit about it, but this piece was first performed at Black Mountain College in 1948. Sarah has been artistic director of DeCamera since 1994 and general director since 2001. She's a renowned pianist. She is a close friend of the Menil. I love talking to Sarah. Sarah knows how to bring together art, music, and history together in such an amazing way, and we're excited to continue the conversation together after the performance and the talk, so save your questions until the end so we can have the conversation then. So if you could please help me welcome Suzanne Hudson.
Hi, is this a good volume? Yeah, in the back as well? Yeah. Well, thank you so much. Oh, perfect, thank you. Michelle, thank you so much for the invitation. And Tony, thank you so much for getting me here and getting me set up. So thank you all for being here as well. I know that I'm going to try to keep this to 30 minutes or under, so I'm going to jump right in. I will be reading a bit, and I'm also wildly digressive, and I'm sure I cannot help myself from kind of going off script from time to time. And I'm also very happy to answer any questions later in the evening, as Michelle indicated. So I'm thrilled to talk about this terrific show, which assumes, I think, relationships between the artists brought together, that they influenced each other reciprocally, and that their collected work necessarily forms something like a conversation. In some ways, we might take this for granted, given the fact that during the late 1950s and early 1960s, Chrissa, Robert Indiana, Ellsworth Kelly, Agnes Martin, Lenore Tawney, and Jack Youngerman all lived or worked in the seaport neighborhood of Coenties Slip, an area in lower Manhattan along the East River in sight of the Brooklyn Bridge. It was a kind of creative enclave at some physical distance from the haunts frequented by the New York School painters somewhat further uptown. And forgive me if I'm looking down a lot. This is entirely my fault. I've printed this, I'm realizing now, with a font that is smaller than would have been advisable. So I'm not ignoring you. I apologize if I'm looking at the page more than out to you, but you will understand why. So in his photographs of the inhabitants of the Slip, Hans Nemeth shows scenes of sociability that further perpetuate a vision of the community as exceedingly tight-knit. Since immortalized as a Coldwater Flat queer bohemia, the place was already a remnant of another past by the time these artists got there. And so here you see an earlier 19th century image of the dock, and it was also, of course, commemorated by Herman Melville in Moby Dick. So this is to say it had long been occupied by other industries when the artists took up their studios. Any traces of the old maritime prospect, where sailors and drifters drank and looked across the river, where barges were tied up, were long gone. In 1974, Hilton Kramer sized up, quote, the aura of romance at the Slip, and he said it was, quote, associated with periods of obscurity and struggle in the lives of artists who afterward attain a widespread renown. It helps, too, if the original buildings occupying the location are demolished or otherwise radically altered. Myth flourishes in the absence of mundane physical evidence. So that, again, was Hilton Kramer in 1974. But I want to suggest that myth has flourished there, too, no doubt thanks to the former inhabitants, not least of whom Agnes Martin was, seemingly paradoxically, thereafter adamant that she not be circumscribed by her decade in this location. This is not to suggest that her work was not imbricated with the developments of her peers, and in fact, that's precisely what I'm talking about, is that it was. But that she protested, I think, a little bit too much, and I think that's something that I want us to think about, what that meant in terms of her reception, but also how the shift that she wanted within her own career to focus on her as an individual apart from the group, what that tells us about her historiography, and how thinking about these artists together proposes a model that I think is very distinct from the typical monographic show that we really have inherited as the kind of standard unit of measure. How would the history of this period or other periods look if shows like this were more common, if we were to take friendship and sociability as a kind of way of thinking about art making, whether or not the artists concede to their having been influenced, even if reciprocally, by the other artists and their kind of peer group or cohort. In the words of Frances Morris, the co-curator of the recent traveling retrospective of the artist, Agnes Martin emphatically, quote, dismissed suggestions of creative interchange. This, as Morris avows, is a profound mischaracterization. And I'm going to come back to these in just a moment. Morris also quotes Kelly remembering a quote-unquote close fraternal relationship with a real pal in Martin, and others similarly testify to how her neighbors and friends were a support system through periods of fragile mental health. And this is something that I'm very happy to address in the questions, but for those of you who are not aware, Martin was a schizophrenic and actually was hospitalized in late 1961, 1962, and Tawney and younger men and many of these artists took exceedingly good care of her, including but not limited to paying some of her medical bills. In Tawney's case, actually hanging shows of hers at Elkan's gallery when she was incapacitated and unable to do that for herself, and other things besides. But what I'm showing you here is a much more kind of happenstance, everyday scene than any of this. For her part, Martin was exquisitely conscious of the weight of self-fashioning, and she produced in time a public Martin coincident with the art she deemed fit to leave the studio, at least in the period that marked her retrospection and stock-taking in the 1970s, where she redrew the narrative of her earlier career and downplayed the significance of her period on the slip, which was all but imagined to be kind of absolutely central up until this period. Yet, the significance of this remains great, her protests notwithstanding. This was the community in which her art moved to more resolute geometry, predicated upon squares, triangles, and circles. She also scavenged considerably more obdurate stuff from the surrounding workyards and interiors of old buildings, creating three-dimensional assemblages in the early 1960s. As with the laws, this is an earlier example from 1958. These found object pieces coexisted alongside her first grid paintings for a few years, and I think this is very interesting. It wasn't like there was an immediate move away from this kind of scavenged object-based sculptural practice into the grid painting that she became kind of associated with very soon thereafter. But she was kind of doing both of these things for a few years, from the late 50s into the early 60s. The arrangements of objects in her studio might move from, say, wire with bottle caps to oil on canvas circles, with the same composition even. In all these instances, she was aiming at a quote-unquote holistic form with kinship to the form of the canvas itself. And I think you can see that here in the Nails Lining Little Sister from 1962, where she actually redoubles the weave of the grid with both drawn marks, but also kind of physical nails kind of moved forcibly through the canvas surface. If Martin was subsequently emboldened to deny this place as an influence, it might have something to do with her having learned the practice of strategic presentation from her dealer. When Martin moved to New York from New Mexico to join Betty Parsons' stable in 1958, she was 46 years old. It was in Taos in 1956 that Parsons first encountered Martin's work, at that time a kind of biomorphic abstraction heavily indebted to Cubist and Surrealist idioms, as well as to abstraction in the area. And I'm sure if you come back for Christina's talk, her book is tremendous, and she traces very carefully Martin's time in New Mexico and goes through this much more carefully than I will this evening. But 1958 was also the year that Parsons rebooted her own enterprise with what she called fresh talent, quote unquote, gifted but yet unknown painters. And she ensured that Martin fit this criteria by foregoing disclosure of Martin's prior exhibition history from her years in New Mexico. This meant that as late as 1966, critics like Max Kozlov assumed that Martin was younger at the time of her debut. He, for one, regarded her work as, quote, a midpoint between the sensibility of the early 50s, with its loosely structured and empathetic recall of the outer world, and the computerized pictorial systems of today. In point of fact, Martin was the exact contemporary of Jackson Pollock, and a year older than Ad Reinhardt, and she maintained throughout that she was an abstract expressionist, and I'm also happy to talk more about that later if that's of interest. In any case, Martin rented her space at building number 27 from Jack Youngerman, to whom Parsons had introduced her, and his wife, actress and filmmaker Delphine Seyrig. Fred Mitchell had been the first to arrive on the slip. In 1954, he settled at number 31, which became Robert Indiana's loft in 1956. At the same time, Ellsworth Kelly made his studio at 3-5. Youngerman and Seyrig also rented space to Tawney and Ann Wilson. When number 27 was torn down in 1960, Wilson and Martin relocated to 3-5, along with James Rosenquist and Charles Hinman. While Martin gave the impression that transmission of ideas amongst her group was anathema, there are connections of strategy and form and rivalries registered in the lacunae. For one thing, the three painters, Martin, Indiana, and Kelly, each experimented with non-painterly techniques and made sculptural objects, as in the laws that I just showed you. By the time the work, The Art of Assemblage in 1961 was on view in Midtown at MoMA, where Indiana's work was shown together with that of Johns and Rauschenberg, Martin had mostly phased out the style that the show was in any case summarizing. And yet still in 1963, and you have the very rare opportunity to see this in the gallery, this is the Wave from 1963, she was still making works that actually did move into 3 dimensions and had kind of elements of wood and metal. And this actually was a game, and she had this in a show that was Artist Games, actually, in the same year that it was made, and it was meant to be manipulated. And of course, necessarily, you see it now static, but you have to imagine the balls kind of moving around and kind of scattering throughout each manipulation. And she likened the sound of that to waves crashing, and so it has a kind of acoustic element to it if it were able to be played. Martin's assemblages from this year and before relate to Indiana's upright sculptures of scarred, patinated materials taken from buildings and ship, and like this one, Ahab, even titled in reference to this geography. They were often imprinted with text made with the aid of recovered stencils. He called the sculptures made from discarded lumber herms, in reference to the ancient Greek statues that functioned as roadside markers delineating territory and flagged the contemporary locality with seafaring monikers. Again, Ahab here, but he had others called School of the Slip and so on. And in fact, in the show, you see the ginkgo leaves from the nearby park, and also a work actually called Coenties Slip. So you really get a sense of the environment as being formative and kind of deeply impressionable for his work. The same might be said for, and this is just a great picture of him in his studio from 1963. The same might be said for Kelly, who in these years executed, among others, a series of meticulously made paintings in red, green, and blue. And here's one example that you see here, coming out of the kind of line of the trapeze that you can see in these images. And here you have Ellsworth Kelly and Agnes Martin together, and they were very, very close. Excuse me, I lost my place. It's like tiny writing, I apologize. Francis Morris again reminds us that influence rarely works in one direction, and poses the possibility, via their exchange of ideas, that Martin actually led Kelly to sculpture. He would later recall, "I happened to be having breakfast with Agnes Martin in her studio. I made a model for the piece called Pony from the top of a coffee container that we used at breakfast." So he's been very forthright about their correspondences and kind of actually daily meals even, and she has less so on the historical record repaid that favor. So too with Lenore Tawney. Tawney became not only an especially close friend, but an interlocutor, collector, and patron, purchasing, among others, the laws that I showed you earlier, Kali and Homage to Greece. Thanks to a small inheritance that she received upon the death of her husband in 1943, she supported Martin monetarily besides. In 1955, she began her open warp weavings. These left the room and hung in open space freed from the wall. Moving between 2 and 3 dimensions, she also drew, wrote poetry, drafted numinous statements, and made collages out of woven strips of paper, into which she eventually began incorporating bones, feathers, eggs, and manuscript fragments. At the slip, as you see here, she wove into her works short metal or wood dowels to create shifts in plane. Sometimes these curved slightly to add dimension. Once, seemingly without realizing what the other was doing, Martin and Tawney began river works, a fact unsurprising perhaps given the proximity of their workspaces to the river. Nonetheless, as Tawney recounted, the river was right there out my window. I looked at it every day. During that winter, Martin and I would talk on the phone, though we hardly ever saw each other. One day she said, "I'm doing the river," and I said, "Oh, I'm doing the river too." She was painting a river, and there I was weaving a river, and mine was black. The correspondences continue. The color blue, so important to Martin's early grids, was Tawney's touchstone and signature. On the level of technique, Sid Sachs claims that in addition to a T-square and a ruler, Martin used threads to track vertical and horizontal coordinates, a trick assimilated from watching Tawney dress her loom. So close was the pair that Martin contributed a statement for Tawney's show at the Staten Island Museum, which opened in November 1961. Though Martin would later give interviews about her friendship and affinity with Richard Tuttle and also admit Reinhardt as a kind of friend and I would actually say influence. It might be the only time where she really admitted influence. This text that she penned for Tawney was actually the only instance where she ever wrote expressly about another artist. And I won't read you the whole thing, but she says, "Lately we have been seeing new expression in many media, and that is expected, but to see a new and original expression in a very old medium, and not just one in a new form, but a complete and new form, is wholly unlooked for and is a wonderful and gratifying experience." And it goes on in an incredibly affirmative way. At the very end, she says, "There is penetration, there is an urgency that sweeps us up, an originality and success that holds us in wonder. Art treasures indeed, this work is wholly done, and we can all be proud." So one might assess the relevance of these words, I think, for Martin as much as for Tawney. The closing, "we can all be proud," is, for the biographer Nancy Princenthal, a fulsome acclamation of not individual but collective accomplishment. Indeed, the works at Staten Island also bore formal affinities that lingered, so that in 1975, a reviewer still saw fit to pronounce Tawney's output in flax as equivalent to Martin's, even as Tawney became part of a developing and increasingly segregated history of fiber art. Furthermore, the exhibition's checklist sounds like it could have been Martin's, with titles including Flowing Tree, Shore, Navy Celestial, Deep Water, and Seaweed, which we have here, and is, I think, an amazing work, which I had never had the opportunity to see, and is remarkable. So Tawney and Martin admitted that Martin had named 3 of Tawney's hanging lace-like sculptures, the Bride, the King, and Queen, which were then shown in 1963 in woven forms at the Museum of Contemporary Crafts in New York. Then there is the fact that in these years as well, Tawney named many of Martin's works, although actually in the 1970s, she often tried to strip the titles that Tawney gave her work away, which was not the case for Tawney's. The titles that Martin titled for Tawney persisted. All of this is perhaps to say that it is near impossible to cordon off Martin's work from that of her peers, irrespective of her gripes to the contrary. Plus, the silences resound. In an interview conducted in 1989 for the Archives of American Art, Smithsonian Institution, Martin recalled that all of the residents of the slip were given to walking across the Brooklyn Bridge, going to Prospect Park, taking the ferry to Staten Island, but that they did these things in solitude. Quote, "Yeah, we did all the same things, but we did it alone." And here you're seeing Night Sea, her great painting from 1963, which I'll talk more about in just a moment. There is in this language no mention of her breakfasts with Kelly or her performances of Gertrude Stein's erotic poetry, her specialty, as Indiana has memorably recalled. When asked about who else was there, Martin presented herself as the only woman. Quote, Ellsworth Kelly was in the same building that I was in. He had the top floor with the skylights. Then, just down the street were Indiana and Youngerman, and around the corner on Pearl Street were Rauschenberg and Jasper Johns. She never names Tawney. By contrast, Tawney readily supplied the presence of Martin in her similar interview for the archives, which she recorded in 1971. Nevertheless, there are two paintings that Martin made in 1963 that evidence more forthrightly the matter of friendship that I think this exhibition makes so plain. So here we see Night Sea, and this is actually called Friendship. It's also from 1963. As you can see, both are major grids. Let me come to Friendship first. For Friendship, Martin applied gold leaf to the whole ground, laying bare the white gesso-covered canvas in thin slivers cut across the glittering shroud. Gold is physically immutable but radically contingent to effects of atmosphere, and as pictorial space, it is both undefined and infinite. It is brute fact and exalted symbol. The sighting of gilded surfaces in dark medieval churches, where they served as agents of illumination, reminds us of this. Night Sea has no less kind of noble background, this deep ultramarine field crossed with the spindliest of gold lines, and it also relates to lapis and the kind of history of that mineral being used for the depiction of the robes of the Virgin and so on, an incredibly precious material, actually more expensive even than gold. Martin never named the inspiration for the experience of friendship that gave this exquisite painting its title. One might assume, though she never offered any hints, that Tawney was very much on her mind. As I mentioned, the painting was made in 1963 when their relationship was reaching its zenith. It was a momentous year for Tawney, too, with her show Woven Forms that I mentioned earlier, as well as MoMA's purchase of Dark River wall hanging from 1961. Tawney was likely impacted as well, as was Martin, I think, in this use of gold, by Robert Indiana's paintings of circles from 1959, where he used white gesso and gold leaf on wood or wallboard ripped from his loft, for she began to use gold thread. In 1962, Tawney completed, among other related works, The Path, a narrow hanging construction in linen and 24-karat gold. She insisted on the holistic nature of the human voyage and saw her art at this moment as a form of devotional practice, which is what I think led her to a number of commissions, including the one you see here for Arkvale. This was a commission that was done in 24-karat gold wire, and it was for a synagogue in Highland Park, Illinois. The latter was, in her words, a veil of light and dark that hangs between you and the mystery of the Holy Scrolls, not hiding but enhancing the mystery. In a letter dated 25th of October, 1963, Agnes Martin wrote, "Dear Lenore, I'm not going to be able to tell you anything really. You have made this day the turning point in my life. It means an enormous opportunity to me. Now I can take my time and really get to work. The whole scene has changed. There is no way to grasp the size of it. There is no way for me to get a hold of it all. I do not think you will even be able to imagine a small part of the enormous change in my position. Any expression of gratitude is like the soundless sound. It is going to be like waves, over and over again. Forever is not too long. I think this is the real thing, Agnes." So this dispatch comes in one pass, or seems to have been rewritten after she decided upon the words, for it, unlike so many of Martin's notes, has nothing stricken out. The reason for her gratitude is unclear, with Tawney having given Martin financial support and kind of nursed her through her hospitalization, which this painting and friendship kind of came to fruition on the heels of. But she also had recently gifted the white flower to the Guggenheim, and that was actually the first painting of Martin's ever to enter a museum collection, and it did so anonymously, and it's only many decades later, actually, that Tawney's name now appears with this gift. Decades on, when both were old women, Tawney included with a photo of the two in Taos, "Dear Agnes, I enclose a copy of a picture of us walking into oblivion together. We had such a great time at dinner with you." This gives the false impression that Martin and Tawney rode off into the sunset, a happy ending compromised by the facts of what transpired in the years between. They seem to have stayed close into the 60s when they traveled together after Martin left New York in 1967. Tawney was present at Martin's opening at the Whitney Museum in the early 90s and loaned the laws to that and other exhibitions. She was a frequent visitor to Santa Fe and even purchased property in the area with an intention to buy a small house. To build a small house. But this was, this was a kind of healing of a wound that happened sometime in between, the details of which, like so much else, remain obscure and particularly difficult to characterize, given the seeming perversity of these expressions of fondness after the brutal fact. And Martin has many instances on record where she really travestied everything about Tawney, from trying to strip away the titles, saying like she only did those things when she wasn't able to herself. She also told a reporter, Lizzie Borden, that she didn't like Tawney's work. This was all in the 70s, and they clearly had some kind of falling out, the details of which are absolutely unclear, but did seem to kind of mend this after that. So by way of conclusion, let me pose whether we should chalk this up to gossip and render it inadmissible to the record, or claim it otherwise. I, for one, think it matters a great deal because it reminds us, and perhaps this goes without saying, but people who make art are people with lives no more or less complicated than those of anyone else. To frame her experience as Martin did was her right. To set it into a larger context is our responsibility. We must ask why her art world and her framing of it prized individuality as it did, and where we stand relative to these issues now. How might creativity be born in and of conversation? What would a history look like if told not through single actors, monographic books and shows, but of communities of making and thinking and friendship as the basis for work, as it so clearly was for Night Sea and Friendship, and I think all the works collected here down the hall. In closing, I want to pose questions as to why artists such as Martin wanted singularity, what needs such framing served, and what conditions it might admit. She navigated the art world and made the identification she needed to develop and get recognized until she could stand alone. And this, and I'll finish with this painting, claims for her allegiance to abstract expressionism, I think, find a really amazing outlet. And in the book that Michelle mentioned, I have a whole argument about this work in relation actually to Carl Jung and ideas of the night sea journey, and see her response to landscape as also being one that's absolutely about the framing of landscape through the aesthetic act or the literary genre or the kind of pre-existing form, which is, I think, why the grid became so totally useful to her. But so too the night sea as a kind of journey of the soul or journey of the person kind of through the proverbial challenges of life, which she understood apart from biography, but as a kind of more abstract universal. Biblical stories all the way through Alice's adventures in Wonderland pose the kind of lone protagonist as the main actor. It is also, and not coincidentally, the language Harold Rosenberg used in 1952 in Art News, writing about self-expression and the American action painters, where he charged that the American vanguard painter took to the white expanse of canvas as Melville's Ishmael took to the sea. The appeal of the metaphor for Rosenberg was the transcendental search for meaning in which the personal becomes the universal. In this way, Martin's attachment to these ideas is generational. So then was her desire not to be. Thank you. I'm not sure. Should I? Okay.
I just want to say a few words before I play this wonderful piece by John Gage. It's called In a Landscape. Can you hear me? First of all, I'm thrilled to be part of this. I neighborhood either. So there's two discoveries, and it's such a gem of a show, and wonderful to hear all of that background from people from Suzanne. Michelle had this idea to ask me to play in a landscape, and when I saw the exhibit, I was just thrilled. It's a really inspired idea. I think there's an immediate affinity that you'll hear between what Cage is doing in 1948 and what many of these artists are involved with. The parallels are interesting because so often when we talk about music, we borrow language from painting, from art. We borrow visual language and we talk about color in terms of timbres of instruments and sound. We talk about brightness and darkness, and those are all visual metaphors that we translate onto sound and somehow understand. Even on the piano, high and low is a visual metaphor. It's more about space than it is about sound. But what you see in these paintings is the musical element, which is time. Music exists in time, and it's a much more different thing when you start talking about time in a painting. And of course, time and nature are very, very tied up. And there's a very natural progression from the idea of landscape to the idea of abstraction. When we look at landscapes, I mean, one of the basic ideas is horizon, as you see in that beautiful Agnes Martin waves. So the idea of horizon is just a simple line, a line on a page, and you've kind of divided the space already into land and sky or land and sea. But that immediately takes us somewhere. And of course, the line is also a line of time. So we can talk a little bit more specifically about some of the paintings and how they relate. There are many, many areas of affinity, but I thought first it might be nice just to hear the music. So this is John Cage in a landscape. He was also living in Lower Manhattan when he wrote this in 1948.
I was talking about how the paintings have so much time in them, and yet this piece of music Cage calls in a landscape, which is, in a way, the antithesis of time. He's trying to be in a place, and I think that piece very much is about staying in the same place. And that was kind of a radical thing in music. It's one of the radical things about Cage, where he's not looking for events in music or in dramatic moments, but in a kind of stillness, which I think you all see is, a strong parallel to the kind of landscape that Agnes Martin is doing. So there's a very interesting, I think, dialogue going on there. The other thing that I think is a real similarity is that in these abstract paintings, there's a kind of focus on patterns and the repetition of patterns, sometimes a pattern just being the same thing repeated, but then creating that kind of pattern. So it's a kind of distillation of how we see. And when you look at the waves of water or fields of grass or whatever, of I don't like to say reducing, but really distilling the patterns that the eye is seeing to something very essential and making that an abstract painting. And in this composition, Cage does something very similar by just picking a group of notes. He doesn't go away from a kind of pattern of sound that he focuses this piece on and then extends into a composition, which is very different from classical work, say, that is a sonata form where there's a real dramatic form to it that's more like a narrative. This, with Cage, is much more an extension of time, and also very tied to his discovery of Zen Buddhism. And there are some echoes of that in the exhibit as well. I don't know anything about the background of these people, but Lenore Tawney, the seaweed scroll, that beautiful hanging scroll, recalls Japanese, Chinese, that kind of ancient or Asian art. There are a number of references to that in this, and there's certainly a very sense of Zen in terms of spirit and peace and calmness, and that's something that Cage was very involved with in developing that relationship to nature, which was one of peace and of consonance. And his music, especially in this piece, is not involved with tension, which so much of music creates its drama out of creating tension and then creating release. And similarly, I think, you can think of a lot of art where there's tension, there's contrast, there's drama. And this aesthetic in both the visual and in the music is very much about something else. So maybe just to start.
And, I've thought a lot about grouping this work, and one way I've been framing it is that it's entirely distinct from what was happening in Midtown, right? This sort of exuberance of abstract expressionism. And my question for you, Sarah, was within Cage's career, what makes this composition sort of unique in this specific moment, in this specific time or even is there a way to think about it within the same conversation that we're having between the work in Lower Manhattan versus what was happening uptown with abstract expressionism?
Well, Cage he's involved with the uptown artists, as well. He's involved with Rauschenberg, and then he meets Merce Cunningham, whom he becomes his life partner. So Cage is very involved in abstract in general, and then Morton Feldman moves downstairs from him. Where this piece fits, I'm not even sure if I'm really prepared to answer that, but around this time is when Cage is getting very involved with Zen. This is one of his most popular pieces because it's such a beautiful piece to listen to, and Cage is very much of a philosopher and an inventor as well. And sometimes what he's doing is not so much about the way things sound, but in this piece I think he is very concerned about, the sound of it and creating that full environment. As his work gets more extreme, it's sometimes about something beyond what you're actually hearing. And, then the most extreme piece in a way that he wrote, which I performed here, is his 4 minutes, 38 seconds, right? Where absolutely nothing is performed on the piano. You sit at the piano, and people sometimes say, and the piece is, 4 minutes and 38 seconds of silence, but in a way, what he's saying is there's no such thing as silence, because in that 4 minutes and 38 seconds, you will hear a lot, even if it's just the breathing of the person next to you. And Cage becomes about that, about listening for a minute anywhere, and that becomes, you can compose anywhere you are. You know, you're on the bus and you listen, and that becomes the composition that you are in, and you will never hear that exact composition again. So on that level, I think, you know, he's very much about, you know, all music is about listening, and all painting is about looking, and it's about the experience of looking. And there's a real parallel there, and where I think that they're trying to get to the essence of what those activities are.
I mean, Suzanne, could you talk a little bit about, I mean, that's why I think like, this Cage is such a beautiful way of understanding Agnes Martin's approach to the landscape. I mean, I think we can understand it more in music than we can in the sort of traditional, you know, landscape tradition in painting.
Although, I mean, it's interesting because, so Martin, and I forgive me, this was a very kind of quick part of the talk, but in the 70s was when Martin started kind of appearing in her own retrospection. So there was, in the early 70s, an exhibition at the ICA in Philadelphia, and that was when she kind of redrafted the story of her life up until that point. And one of the main points of correction, let's say, regarded landscape. So a lot of the early writing on Martin had precisely tried to kind of understand it as not a literal transcription of her standing kind of in a field, depicting that field, but very much in the way that you characterize it, kind of thinking about patterns or repetition or even sensations, feelings, emotions that would be more abstract that you might get by standing on a seashore or by climbing a mountain or by looking at a field of grass. And she went along with this for a very long time, and in the 70s was like, no, my work has nothing to do with landscape anymore. But in a funny way, like even just bracketing everything, whether we agree with her earlier or later characterization of the work, and I think that's something we can think about. But it struck me as you talked about the silent piece that in some ways what I'm trying to argue with her work with the gold and the kind of mercurial nature of those two larger grid paintings that I showed at the very end, it's very much like this idea of kind of it never being the same painting twice. And I think why she used the gold, I mean, there are earlier instances of gold from the 50s, many of which were destroyed, but a couple survive. Some are kind of under other paintings. She reused compositions kind of over and over again for pragmatic kind of financial reasons. Or if she wasn't happy with it, she would keep working. So that wasn't her first or only use of gold, but that is the only time that she covered a whole surface. And I read that as having so much to do with her trying to, within the physical materiality of the thing, conjure ephemerality, like have a surface that would never be the same twice. And I think she was very interested in reflection and movement in front of it and all of these kind of ephemeral aspects of something that actually, because of it being a stable physical object, the thing itself wasn't changing, but the kind of phenomenal responses to it would. And so I actually see some of these works as being maybe more akin even to the silent Cage in some ways, although I think there are kind of ways that we could think of her in both regards. But after this moment in 1963, she realized that even the graphite she was using had a subtle glint, and so she didn't need such kind of flamboyant materials to achieve this kind of perceptual flicker. But I think it did have to do with flux and kind of never stepping into the same river twice, that you would see these paintings over and over, and they would kind of always and never be the same. And I think that in some ways is a kind of different idea of landscape also.
Well, and I think it's also about, it's the relationship to the viewer. It's allowing tremendous space for the viewer to fill themselves. I mean, that's what I think you mean in terms of the subjectivity. And that's something, I mean, that goes back. It does go back, but we see it reappearing in different times. I mean, it makes me think of Charles Baudelaire, the great French poet and art critic in the 19th century, and he said that when you're making art, you know, you should always leave a gap, a lacuna, he calls it, for the viewer, the reader, that person to fill in themselves. And I think much of great art does that in different ways. But this exhibit, I think, is filled with space for the viewer, as is, that piece of cage is certainly filled with space for the viewer to fill as they like. And of course, we all have that experience in life with landscape. You go back to the same seashore every summer, and it's the changes in you that make it, well, of course, the landscape also changes, and in this day and age more than we would like, but still, there's that measuring of oneself against something that is more of a constant. But it also, what you're saying about getting rid of the glint, Mark Rothko went through the same thing after all of his success with his big, bold, beautifully colored paintings. He started regretting the color, almost like, that was too easy.
Yeah.
And could he reach people getting rid of that color?
Yeah.
So for sake of time, I'm going to open the floor to questions, if anyone has any.
Was Agnes Martin using the grid as a kind of coping mechanism for her schizophrenia?
This is something that a lot of people are wondering now. So, within her lifetime, her close friends, everyone was aware of this, and yet it's somehow, and actually even Jill Johnston, a newspaper writer who Martin had kind of an ongoing friendship with, let's say, she wrote about both of them being crazy, and so this was in the Village Voice even. But I think, and actually a lot of her writing talks about voices and inspiration, and I think people took it more metaphorically, which is probably how she intended it, but I think it was meant to kind of work in different ways. But now it's really only been since after I guess really when the Tate catalog came out, that's the first time that it's been extremely forthright and just kind of like, she had schizophrenia. Here, we'll give it a name. Here it is. And I think Nancy Princenthal's biography is really excellent on this count. She talks a lot about kind of different therapies in this period and kind of thinking about what Martin would have actually been subject to. We know she was at Bellevue. We know actually who some of her doctors were because she actually traded treatment for paintings. And so a lot of this is kind of still coming out. So there are a wide variety of opinions. What I am kind of inclined to think is that it might have been a way of kind of ordering herself, but I don't see it as a way of how to say this? So Arnie Glimsher, her dealer and very good friend over many years since the early 70s, has talked about the fact that when she was having a breakdown of some kind, she was fallow. She was not actually able to work. And so I don't see the painting as somehow either bringing her to health or, it's not curative, I don't think. But I think she was able to work in periods of psychological stability, and perhaps that maintained that for her. But I don't see it as either symptomatic of an illness necessarily, nor as curative of that, but kind of existing in the in-between, maybe as a way of kind of holding it in place. But I'm certainly not a psychologist, and that's kind of what I see on a formal or material and also biographical level. But I think it's something that's very much subject to interpretation, and actually the Rothko's an interesting case here too. I think that, it's always an incredibly tricky thing to figure out how to kind of think about mental states in relation to any form of art making, but I think especially abstraction, and abstraction in this period. And so I would absolutely not want to be the last word on that, but I think you've kind of hit upon a very central issue.
But I think when you talk about Rothko, it is interesting. You always feel like Martin is striving for peace, and Rothko is not.
Yeah.
Rothko's putting it all out there for you to experience the wildness of the emotion, and you do sense that Agnes Martin is striving to really keep things extremely contained.
Yeah. And she actually, I think she started around this period also after she had been hospitalized for this really prolonged period, not wanting the works to look as kind of procedural. I think she wanted to give this impression of kind of calm and beauty and contentment that was unburdened by all of this turmoil.
I found it fascinating to think of her search as going, like in Cage's case, going against the idea of narrative, because I think that the grids to me are almost like scores scores for time and place in painting, and I think in one of the documentary films on Agnes Martin, she said that it was a form of meditation, and I certainly feel like that's really how I see her art. It's almost like an inward look into being, rather than what you see as, who you are. And, but I think that the narrative point that you brought up is really interesting, because it's definitely the obliteration of it completely, and obviously that, that takes you to a sense of peace.
I'm curious too, as just when she started to think about the materials she was using as, being something that was, both the gold and then the lead and the material of the pencil as being something that was constantly changing, right? That it was something that the viewer engaged with, because in Cage and those writings on Terry Riley's In C talks about, this most sort of perfect work of art in essence, is that something that's, it's never the same. And so you can posit that about her work, but that built into the score of In C is that every time it's performed, it's always different, and it's different also because the musicians, I don't know if you're familiar, but that are performing it, they get to go in and alter it of their own sort of choosing. It's their own discretion. So, my question is, one, her awareness of the writings of Cage and what, the timeline is from when she's actually stating that. So that was in '64 when Terry Riley did that piece, and then when that material was coming out in terms of her awareness.
The answer is that we don't know. Mona Schreen, who's a German scholar, has a book that has not yet been translated, but it's a great book on Agnes Martin, and she deals a lot with her interest in Asian philosophy and aesthetics and Cage, and she's tried very hard to figure out this question and has not been able to. Martin was from the west coast of Canada and actually lived in Los Angeles, and Cage was from Los Angeles, and there are moments on the west coast very early where she could have become aware not only of him, but also, as you mentioned, these kinds of other philosophies that would open on to this kind of thinking. She was in New York in the early 50s, in the 40s and 50s, again in the period that I'm describing. It's really hard to tell because she backdates things, she changes things, her writings are wildly inconsistent, her interviews are actually inconsistent as well. Even within the course of a transcript, if you follow it, she'll say things that contradict kind of factual information given earlier, not even interpretive. So it's very difficult to say. I'm sorry not to give you an answer, but I don't think we have one.
I have a quick comment and a question, and I really enjoyed what you said, Suzanne, about thinking about artistic community and what the show is giving us and looking at a really fascinating labyrinth of friendships. And what you said, imagining what art history might look like if we did that more often. And I think it's interesting to think about the way art history is taught and how often rivalry is part of, there's a sense of, these rivalries between artists that we hear about. And I think even if you look at exhibitions that have paired artists in the past, like Matisse, Picasso at MoMA, there was a sense of rivalry in the way that the work was described, but also even in the, which artist is better and greater, and that is much less interesting. And I know that, I share, Michelle, your interest in artistic community and friendship, and, also, with artists on the Bowery like Saul LeWitt and Eva Hess. I think there's so many untold histories here. And I guess my question is, what artistic communities or friendships do either of you think have yet to be really explored? Are there, I was really fascinated by the connections between Tawney and Martin and knew only a tiny bit about that, and that I think that's been a real revelation of your show. But are there others out there that you think we have not yet really looked at enough?
That's a great question.
It's a show waiting to do, Veronica.
Okay,
It's
let's do
waiting
it.
for you. But, especially relationships between two women and two women artists, like the sort of antagonistic relationships you're talking about are always like two men, right? Like it's a sort of masculine way of understanding relationships. So that's why I am also think the relationship between Tawney and Martin is so untapped and so incredible and exciting for that reason.
I don't know. I'll have to think about that and to continue that conversation. But I mean, I think just as a kind of structure of thinking in a more abstract way, I mean, places and art schools and even extending to different ways to rethink regionalism, possibly. I mean, I think that we've lost sight of, I mean, you have either a kind of Wolflinian, like either or it's a kind of, you have the double slide projector kind of model. And here I'm just talking about within pedagogy, because you broached that, but kind of thinking either about there's like the one image or there's the compare contrast. And usually it is rivalrous and one has to lose at the expense of the other winning. And so to think about what it would be just to kind of populate these images further or to allow more people in and to think about how many things kind of happen in these less formal ways. And I feared getting into material tonight that might be perceived as salacious or gossipy, and I don't mean it that way at all. I mean it really as a challenge to kind of think seriously about the messiness of all of our lives. And we know that to be true because we live it, and yet we separate our kind of understanding of history from this kind of very proximate kind of understanding of these things. And I mean, from the teaching perspective too, what I think is interesting is, if we look at other historical periods, we don't have access necessarily to this kind of material. And a lot of the time it's about kind of conjecturing. And when we have it, we don't use it. And I think that's a kind of funny mechanism as well. But I think, it's a kind of heroic modernism that we've inherited also, where it is a kind of history of great masterpieces, great avant-garde artists, kind of one after the next, that doesn't accommodate this kind of more lateral or community-based thinking.
I don't know, but I think of the whole beginning of the 20th century, I think only in terms of groups of people. I mean, you have Montmartre in Paris, and you think of, Juan Gris and Picasso and Braque and all these people working together, and you think about the beginning of abstraction at the same time. You have going on in Munich, you have Die Blaue Reiter, and you have groups of people. So I feel like I don't know. I mean, I just feel like we think in terms of, sometimes that gets overemphasized, schools where, in fact, the individual artists are not necessarily as alike, but they're in the same place, but they're pursuing similar questions, especially at the beginning of the 20th century. Yes, those masters come out of them, and then there's Picasso, and you have Matisse coming out of something else, but we do think of these groups often very nostalgically of, and then you had Picasso and Stravinsky and, the Ballet Russe. There are all these groups of things going on in the beginning of the century that have really become extremely, heroic as groups, but
not so much later. And that's what I'm kind of interested in this kind of in this moment where people start becoming singled out. Mm-hmm. And that accords with the teaching and the writing,
When do you think it shifts?
I don't know. Maybe with abstract expressionism and the idea of retreating into a kind of solitary space of the studio and the kind of heroic struggle of the self and the work. And even the idea of the irascibles, that they're a group, but they're not, they don't share, they did not want stylistic affinity, even though it happened, of course, or there were all these ways that they tried to separate themselves out from each other.
Well, and what
even
you're
though,
saying, Agnes Martin was very much like that, very resistant to being seen as part of a group.
Right.
And I feel like even when artists, let's use Ellsworth Kelly as another example, well, he may not have been sort of resistant to expressing his relationships or friendships. Within art history, we're always sort of pulling Ellsworth Kelly out, right? Because he doesn't quite fit anywhere. So even in the discourse, he's separated with his, exploration of abstraction. But suddenly this, for me, this show is really about like, oh my gosh, Agnes Morton and Ellsworth Kelly had breakfast together every morning for a year and a half. Like suddenly these connections provided a way to see their work together.
But I think it's also the way artists make careers now. They are encouraged to be absolute individualists more than they have to be. It's a whole view of careerism that has happened maybe in the last 30 years, that you're not part of a group.
That was the thing, even for her. She understood that by the 70s, that she was on the one hand kind of sycophantic to Virginia Dwan and asking her, like saying that 10 was the best show she'd ever been in, and then also on the public record saying, I was never a minimalist and I regret being in that show. And kind of in the same way that she later tried to get away from this group as a context, she didn't want to be part of any group as a context. And I think that did have to do with the kind of commercialism of her as a kind of individual figure within that market in the 70s.
So we have time for one more question.
One thing that interests me about this group of artists is that Ann Wilson is always mentioned with her quilt-like paintings. Have you come across any photographs documenting it? Because all the other artists have been covered, and she seems to be that ghostly person flowing through this group.
Mm-hmm.
Well, you can certainly, there's some images that exist, but for this show, she certainly would have made a great contribution to this exhibition, but within the sort of scope of our collection, I stuck to 6 artists. But yes, she's another artist that. I know. Well, it's also the Coenties Slip, the last 2 exhibitions on the Coenties Slip left out Lenore Tawney. So we're a few. I will find some for you, Jana. I'm gonna get some for you. It's interesting, but she's definitely not as well known. Did you talk to her?
No, I
for your
didn't.
research?
I
She's
didn't.
still alive.
Yeah.
Okay, one more question.
All right. I guess I have 2 questions. Where do you see Carmen Herrera and her more recent discovery falling into place, especially since, she's 101, and she's been doing work very similar and she was right there in it at the same time. Where do you see her kind of restructuring movements that seem to have surpassed her?
It's a great question and a huge one, and I'm happy. I know we're mindful of the clock, so I'll be really brief, but I'm happy to stick around and talk more in just a minute if you like. I think I'm trying to think of how to say this because I don't want to in any way diminish the significance of her achievement, because precisely what I want to say is it should have happened decades ago, that she's accorded the kind of retrospection that she's now getting at the Whitney, although even still it was 1 floor, not 3 floors or 2 floors. And I think this has a lot to tell us about the kind of mechanisms of publicity and the dispensation of power and for whom and when. And I think it tells us about the blind spots of the art world more so than it tells us about the significance or lack thereof of her work.
I think technology has a huge part to play in her discovery, along with, I can't remember the other name, but that photographer that was recently discovered off of boxes and boxes of reels and films from a storage unit that was sold to some kid. There's a whole documentary on it. And this, my second question is with the concepts that are being used in this group of painting, these groups of works in general by these artists that you have spoken about tonight, where do you see, or would you happen to know, of contemporary artists pushing boundaries on these concepts in similar manners? These are questions that I could give you an email and you could just respond via. I'm clearly not an
sure that I
artist.
understand what you mean by pushing boundaries. Can you say
More like using the concepts that these artists, like kind of looking back and on the concepts that they've focused on, and then, you know, as a younger contemporary artist, pushing those boundaries in a newer manner.
That's a,
Yeah.
that's a great question.
I'll give you my email.
It's a big question. Yeah, let's do that.
Thank you so much for coming tonight.